The wind on the Llano Estacado did not just blow, it scoured. It was a living, malevolent thing. A shapeless beast that sharpened its teeth on the endless flat horizon of the Texas Panhandle before tearing into anything foolish enough to stand upright. It was the year 1875, a time when the high plains were holding their breath between the death of one era and the violent birth of another. On this particular evening, the sky was not a color but a bruise, a swirling mixture of sulphurous yellow and bruised purple that promised a blue norther, that terrifying weather phenomenon where the temperature could drop 40 degrees in the span of 1 hour. The air already smelled of ozone and wet dust, the scent of a storm that would freeze a man's marrow while sandblasting the skin from his face. Tahan rode with his head bowed, his chin tucked deep into the collar of a stolen Union Army greatcoat that was 2 sizes too big for his wire-lean frame. He was a young man, perhaps 26 or 27 years of age, though the sun and the wind had etched lines around his eyes that belonged to an elder. To the United States Cavalry, he was known as Elias Ward, a reliable scout who could read the bend of a blade of grass like a priest read scripture. To the Comanches, the people, he was Tahan of the Wind Wolf Band, a name that tasted of smoke and freedom. Now, he was neither. He was a ghost drifting between 2 worlds that both wanted him dead. His horse, a piebald mare with a chest as broad as an anvil, stumbled. Tahan gritted his teeth as the jolt sent a spike of white-hot agony through his left side. The bullet wound in his shoulder had stopped bleeding hours ago, sealed by a crude poultice of chewed tobacco and mud. But the fever was beginning to knock at the back of his skull, under his ribs. A deep bruising throbbed in time with the mare's heartbeat. "Easy, sister," he whispered in the tongue of the people. The words were snatched away by the gale the moment they left his cracked lips. He patted the mare's neck. Tied to the saddle horn was his life and his likely death. It was a battered leather saddlebag, stained dark with oil and old rain. Inside rested a heavy pouch of gold and silver coins, heavier than any honest man should carry, and a black ledger book with a cracked spine. The ledger was the reason the men were behind him. The gold was the reason they would not stop until they had peeled the skin from his bones. Captain Briggs would be coming. Not now, perhaps, not in the teeth of this devil wind, but he was coming. Briggs, the Indian agent who smiled like a grandfather while he sold government beef to bandits and let Comanche children starve on the reservation. The ledger contained the dates, the weights, the names. It was ink and paper, but to Tahan, it felt as heavy as a tombstone. He looked up, squinting against the stinging grit. The world was vanishing into a wall of gray. There were no landmarks here, no trees to mark the miles, only the endless, flat tableland that drove white men mad with its vastness. But Tahan knew this land. His ancestors had hunted the buffalo here when the herds were so thick they turned the plains black. Now, the buffalo were bone-white piles rotting in the sun, and the land was carved up by wire, indeed. Then he saw it, a single wavering point of light. It was faint, a pinprick of kerosene yellow battling the encroaching dark. A homestead. It stood defiant and foolish in the middle of nowhere, a testament to the stubbornness of the settlers who claimed this earth. Tahan hesitated. To approach a white settlement in this dress, half savage, half soldier, bleeding and armed, was suicide. But the temperature was plummeting. The rain was beginning to mix with the sand, turning the air into a slurry of flying mud. If he stayed in the open tonight, the cold would take him before Briggs ever did. He steered the mare toward the light. He felt the irony settle in his gut like a stone. He was riding toward the people who had stolen this land to beg them for a corner of it to keep from dying. Nora Callahan was not a woman who spooked easily. You could not afford to be skittish when you lived 20 miles from the nearest town, and the only thing standing between you and the void was a Henry repeating rifle and a spine made of iron. She stood in the center of her small kitchen, the walls built of sod and timber that seemed to groan under the assault of the wind. She was 29 years old, though she felt 50. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot, revealing a face that was handsome rather than pretty, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of flint. She wore a work dress made of sturdy calico, hemmed high for walking in the mud, and over it, she wore her late husband's canvas coat. It swallowed her small frame, but it smelled faintly of tobacco and horse sweat, a scent that used to make her cry, but now just made her feel armed. The wind howled down the chimney, making the fire dance nervously in the hearth. Nora checked the window, but the glass was opaque with dust. The storm was a bad one. "Quiet, Buster," she said softly. The dog, a massive, scarred mongrel part wolfhound and part bad attitude, was pacing by the door. His hackles were raised, a ridge of stiff fur running down his spine. He let out a low, vibrating growl that rattled in his chest. Nora reached for the Henry rifle leaning against the table. Her hands moved with the unconscious competence of a soldier. Check the chamber. Lever closed. Hammer at half cock. It had been 2 years since they brought Sean home in the back of a buckboard wagon. 2 years since the day the sun went out. They told her it was a Comanche raiding party that hit the supply train. They told her Sean had died a hero, defending the company payroll. The town of Tascosa had given him a funeral with a flag and a sermon about civilization and savagery. Nora had stood there, dry-eyed and hollow, while the wind whipped her black veil. Since then, she had held this land alone. She had held it against drought. She had held it against the bank in St. Louis that sent polite letters threatening foreclosure. She had held it against the drift of drunken cowboys who thought a widow woman might be lonely enough to welcome a warm body, regardless of the stench of whiskey. Buster barked a sharp, explosive sound that cut through the noise of the storm. Someone was out there. Nora blew out the kerosene lamp on the table, plunging the room into shadows illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire. She moved to the side of the window, peering out through a crack in the shutter. She saw a shape emerge from the swirling dust. A horseman. He moved slowly, the horse's head low. He did not ride toward the house, but drifted toward the barn. A shadow seeking shadow. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her. But Nora Callahan did not hide under the bed. She pulled the collar of Sean's coat up around her neck, thumbed the hammer of the Henry all the way back, and opened the back door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, screaming in her ears, but she lowered her head and marched toward the barn, the dog growling at her heel. The barn was a sanctuary of relative quiet. The wind still battered the roof, but inside, the air was still and thick with the smell of dry hay, old leather, and the warm, musky scent of animals. Tahan slid from the saddle, his legs buckling as they hit the packed earth. He had to grab the stirrup leather to keep from falling. His breath came in ragged gasps. He led the mare into an empty stall, his movement slow and clumsy. He needed to loosen the cinch, let her breathe, but his fingers were numb and unresponsive. He heard the sound behind him before he saw the source. It was the distinct, metallic clack-clack of a lever-action rifle cycling around. He froze. His hand hovered near the knife at his belt, but he knew he was too slow. Not tonight. Tonight, he was slow as molasses in winter. "Turn around," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, but there was no softness in it. It was as hard as the limestone ridges of the canyon. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Tahan turned slowly. Standing in the open doorway, framed by the raging gray storm behind her, was a figure in a man's coat. She held a rifle leveled squarely at his chest. Beside her, a large dog bared teeth that looked white and sharp in the gloom. "I am not armed in my hands," Tahan said. His voice was a rasp, scratching against his throat. He held his palms out, open and empty. The woman stepped into the barn, out of the wind, but she did not lower the weapon. Her eyes swept over him, taking in the long black hair unbound and whipping around his face, the dark skin, the army coat, the blood stain seeping through the leather on his side. "Comanche!" She spat the word. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "You are a long way from the reservation, boy. Are you one of Briggs's scouts, or just a straggler looking to steal a horse?" Tahan coughed, a wet, hacking sound that bent him double for a moment. When he straightened, he saw her finger tighten on the trigger. "No Briggs," he said, the name tasting like bile. No thief. Then what are you doing in my barn? The storm, Tahan said. He gestured vaguely to the door. My horse. She is done. I am done. Nora stared at him. She saw the blood now, dark and slick on his flank. She saw the exhaustion that hung on him like a shroud. But she also saw the face of the enemy, the face that the preacher said belonged to the soulless, the face that she had imagined 1,000 times when she stared at the empty side of her bed. Get out, she said. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with a sudden, surging anger. Get on your horse and ride out. I won't have you here. Tahan looked at her. He saw the grief etched around her mouth. He knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of the women in his tribe when the soldiers rode away. I cannot ride, he said simply. The horse dies if we go back out. I die. That is not my concern. I will pay, Tahan said. The words hung in the air between them, absurd and heavy. Nora blinked, taken aback. You will what? Slowly, moving with exaggerated care so as not to spook her trigger finger. Tahan reached into the deep pocket of the greatcoat. The dog snarled, stepping forward, but the woman hissed a command that held him back. Tahan pulled out a handful of coins, 2 silver dollars and a small gold piece. They glinted dully in the low light. He crouched down, groaning as his ribs protested, and placed the money on the dirt floor. He set them down gently, as if they were fragile eggs. He straightened up and took a step back. For the corner, he said, pointing to the empty stall filled with straw. For 1 bucket of water for the mare. 1 night. I pay. Nora looked at the coins in the dirt. Money. It was a language everyone spoke, but coming from him, it felt wrong. It felt like a trick. I don't want your money, she said. It is good money. Tahan said, Silver is silver. Where did you get it? She asked, her eyes narrowing. Who did you kill for it? Tahan looked at the saddlebag on his horse. Who did I kill? The question echoed. He had not killed for this money. He had stolen it from a thief, but explaining that would take breath he did not have. I pay for shelter, he repeated. Just shelter. Morning comes, the storm stops. I go, you'll never see me again. Nora looked at the storm raging outside. The wind was shrieking now, a banshee wail that shook the rafters. If she sent him out there, he would be dead by midnight. He was wounded. He was alone. She looked at his face again. He wasn't begging. There was no plea in his eyes, only a flat, hard acceptance of reality. He was making a transaction. Nora Callahan was a hard woman. The frontier had made her hard, but she was not a murderer. And turning a wounded man out into a blue norther was murder, pure and simple. She lowered the rifle an inch. You stay in the stall, she said. Her voice clipped. You don't come near the house. You don't make a sound. If I hear that door creak, if I hear this dog bark one time, I will put a bullet in you before you can stand up. Do you understand English well enough for that? I understand, Tahan said. And you leave at first light, she added, before the sun hits the fence post. I don't want trouble. I don't want the sheriff asking why I'm harboring a stray. First light, Tahan agreed. Nora stared at him for 1 long second more, measuring him against the ghost of her husband, against the anger in her heart. Then she stepped back. There is a bucket by the well pump. Water the horse, then lock the door from the inside. I will be barring it from the outside. She didn't look at the money on the ground. She turned on her heel, the coat swirling around her legs, and marched back out into the maelstrom. Tahan watched her go. He waited until he heard the heavy thud of the crossbar falling into place on the outside of the double doors. He was a prisoner, but he was a warm prisoner. He sank to his knees. The pain in his shoulder roared to life now that the adrenaline was fading. He crawled over to the coins he had placed in the dirt. He picked them up, his fingers trembling, and put them back in his pocket. She had not taken them. That was pride. He understood pride. He watered the mare, moving like an old man, then collapsed into the pile of hay in the corner of the stall. The smell of the dry grass was overpowering. It smelled like summer. It smelled like life. Outside, the wind hunted for him, scratching at the wood. furious that he had escaped its jaws. Tahan closed his eyes. He laid his hand on the leather saddlebag next to his head. He could feel the hard rectangle of the ledger book through the leather. The truth, the death warrant. He was lying in a barn built by white men, on land where his grandfather had chased the antelope, hiding from a storm and a white captain, guarded by a widow who wanted him dead but wouldn't kill him. This is the land of my blood, he thought, a bitter smile touching his lips as consciousness began to slip away. And I had to offer silver to sleep on it. The darkness took him, his hand still clutching the bag of sins, gasping for a redemption that felt as distant as the morning sun. The wind did not sleep, and neither did Nora Callahan. She lay in her narrow bed, staring up at the rough-hewn timber beams of the ceiling, listening to the storm dismantle the world outside. The house groaned under the assault. Sand hissed against the window panes like 1,000 snakes seeking entry. But it was not the fury of the elements that kept her eyes wide and burning in the dark. It was the silence between the gusts. In those brief, suffocating pauses, she could hear it. A sound coming from the barn, faint but distinct enough to cut through the roar of the gale. It was a low, animalistic sound of distress, a moan that started deep in the chest and ended in a sharp intake of breath. Nora turned on her side, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Let him be, she told herself. He is a stranger. He is a Comanche. He is a man who carries a gun and gold and secrets. If the fever took him in the night, it was God's will. It would solve the problem of what to do with him when the sun rose. She could drag the body out to the canyon edge, say a prayer, and be done with it. The frontier was paved with the bones of men who had ridden too far and pushed too hard. But the sound came again, louder this time, a cry of delirium. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of Sean. She thought of the night the army chaplain stood on her porch, twisting his hat in his hands, struggling to find the words to tell her that her life was over. She remembered wishing someone had been there to hold Sean's hand, to give him water, to offer a moment of mercy in the dust, with a curse that would have scandalized the ladies of the church auxiliary in town. Nora threw back the quilt. The cold air of the room bit at her skin through her nightdress. She moved with efficient anger, pulling on her heavy work boots and throwing Sean's canvas coat over her shoulders. She went to the kitchen and lit the kerosene lantern, keeping the flame low, into the pockets of the coat. She shoved a roll of clean linen strips she had boiled the week before, a small pair of sewing scissors, a needle with heavy thread, and a half-full bottle of corn whiskey that she kept for toothaches and colics. Finally, she picked up the Henry rifle. "Come on, Buster," she whispered. The dog rose from his spot by the hearth, his nails clicking on the floorboards as he followed her to the back door. The walk to the barn was a battle. The wind tried to tear the lantern from her hand and the coat from her back. Sand stung her cheeks, forcing her to walk with her head down, trusting her memory of the path. When she reached the barn door, she had to use her shoulder to shove it open against the pressure of the gale. Inside, the air was heavy and smelled of distressed animals. The piebald mare was pacing in her stall, her eyes rolling white in the lantern light. In the corner, on the pile of straw, the man lay twisted in a knot of agony. He had kicked off the heavy Union coat in his fever. His chest heaved, slick with sweat despite the biting chill of the drafty barn. As the light hit him, he thrashed, his hand groping blindly at his belt for a knife that sat 3 feet away. "Stay down," Nora commanded, her voice cutting through his delirium. She set the lantern on an overturned crate and leveled the rifle at him one-handed. "Don't you move!" Tahan blinked, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He looked at her, then through her. He said something in his own tongue, a string of guttural, clipped sounds that sounded like a plea to ancestors she did not know. Then his head lolled back against the wood of the stall. Nora leaned the rifle against the stall door, within easy reach, and knelt beside him. Up close, the damage was obvious. The blood had soaked through his buckskin shirt, dark and sticky. The smell of infection, sweet and rotting, was faint but present. "You fool," she muttered. "Riding through a storm with a hole in you. She set the whiskey bottle down and took out the scissors. "I am going to cut your shirt," she said, loud and slow, as if speaking to a child. "Do not fight me." She slipped the cold steel of the scissors under the leather of his tunic. He flinched, but did not stop her. She cut upward, peeling the fabric away from his skin. When she pulled the leather back, Nora drew a sharp breath. The wound was ugly. A bullet had furrowed along his ribs on the left side, deep enough to expose the muscle, but by some miracle missing the lung. It was red and angry, the edges puckered and swollen, but it was not the fresh wound that made her pause. It was the map of violence written on his skin. His chest and arms were a tapestry of scars. There were the thin, white lines of knife fights, the round, puckered craters of old bullet wounds, and across his back, visible as he turned slightly, were the long, raised welts of a whip, lash marks, brutal and systematic. This was not just the body of a warrior. It was the body of a man who had been punished, broken, and stitched back together more times than a man of 25 years should endure. Nora hardened her heart. Scars did not make a saint. "This is going to burn," she said. She uncorked the whiskey and poured a generous amount directly onto the open furrow in his side. Tahan arched his back, a guttural roar tearing from his throat. His hand shot out and gripped Nora's wrist with a strength that shocked her. His fingers were like iron bands. Buster snarled and lunged, snapping at the air inches from Tahan's face. "Down!" Nora shouted at the dog, never taking her eyes off the Comanche. She did not pull away, though his grip was bruising her bone. She looked him dead in the eye. "Let go, or I leave you to rot." Slowly, the tension left his arm. His hand fell away, leaving white finger marks on her wrist. He lay panting, sweat dripping from his nose. "You have a heavy hand, woman," he gasped, his English thick but understandable. "And you have a dirty wound," she retorted. She soaked a cloth in more whiskey and began to scrub the edges of the cut. "Who did this to you Briggs's men?" The name made him flinch more than the alcohol. He turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes clearing for a moment. "Not men," he rasped. "Ghosts. Ghosts in blue coats. Why were you riding alone?" She threaded the needle, holding it up to the lantern light. "Why carry gold like a bandit if you are a scout? Gold buys silence," he whispered. "Or it buys a grave." Nora lined up the edges of the skin. She had stitched up horses, dogs, and once her own leg when she slipped with an axe. Flesh was flesh. She pierced the skin. Tahan gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles jumping, but he did not make a sound. "What is your name?" she asked, trying to keep him focused, trying to keep him from sliding back into the dark. "You speak English too well to be a wild one. The white men, the soldiers, they call me Elias Ward," he said, the syllables coming out in a rhythm of pain. "But I am Tahan, of the Windwolf people." Nora's hand froze mid-stitch. The needle hung suspended in the air. The barn suddenly felt very small and very cold. Elias Ward. She knew that name. She had seen it written in Sean's letters, spelled out in her husband's looping, careful handwriting. "We have a new scout, Nora, a young buck named Elias. Sharp eyes, but quiet. Captain Briggs trusts him to find the water holes." That was 3 months before the ambush. 3 months before Sean died in a box canyon 40 miles west of here. Nora looked down at the man lying in her straw, the man whose life she was saving. "Elias?" she repeated, her voice hollow. "You scouted for the supply trains?" "For Captain Samuel Briggs." Tahan looked up. Sensing the shift in the air, the woman was no longer a nurse. She was something else. "I did," he said warily. "My husband was Sean Callahan," Nora said. She did not shout, which made it worse. "He rode guard on the payroll wagon. November 1873. Tahan closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "The canyon of the Red Rocks, the dry riverbed." "You were there," Nora said. It was an accusation, sharp as a knife. "You led them there. You led them into the ambush." "I was there," Tahan admitted. Nora stood up. The needle swung on its thread against his chest. She backed away, her hands shaking, and grabbed the Henry rifle. She leveled it at his head. The barrel did not waver. "You killed him," she whispered. "You and your savages. You led him into a trap and you butchered him." "No," Tahan said. He tried to sit up, but the pain slammed him back down. He lay flat, looking up into the black bore of the rifle. "Not Comanches. Not my people. Don't lie to me," Nora screamed, the sound cracking her composure. The army report said it was a raiding party. 50 warriors, they said he died fighting. "The army report is ink on paper," Tahan said, his voice rising, gaining strength from his desperation. "Ink lies. The land does not lie." In his struggle to sit up, Tahan's elbow knocked against the saddlebag he had been using as a pillow. The leather flap, unbuckled from his earlier check, fell open. The heavy black ledger slid out and hit the dirt floor with a dull thud. It flopped open, pages ruffling in the draft. Nora's eyes darted to the book. "What is that?" "The truth," Tahan said. "Read it, if you are going to shoot me. Woman, read it first." Nora kept the rifle trained on him with one hand, crouching awkwardly to snatch the book with the other. She retreated to the crate where the lantern sat. She placed the rifle across her knees, never fully looking away from him, and pulled the book into the light. It was a standard-issue quartermaster's ledger. Columns of numbers, dates, signatures. She flipped through the pages. October, 1873, 50 rifles, 2,000 rounds of ammunition, sold to one Cortina. She frowned. Cortina was a bandit leader. Why was an army captain selling rifles to a bandit? She turned the pages, her fingers numb. November 12th, 1873. The date of Sean's death. The entry was written in a precise, cramped hand. She recognized the signature at the bottom. Samuel Briggs. Incident at Red Rock Canyon. Payroll secured. Casualties, 3 guards Callahan. Miller. Schmidt. Expenditure, $20 to acting parties for staging. Note, blame allocated to Quahati Band. Request for additional troop deployment approved. Nora stared at the words. Expenditure, $20 to acting parties for staging. The room spun. The words swam before her eyes. "Staging. He sold the rifles." Tahan's voice came from the shadows, steady and grim. "He sold the food meant for the reservation. He made money on both sides, but he needed a war to keep his command. He needed a reason for the government to send more soldiers, more money." "You're lying?" Nora whispered, but her grip on the book was so tight her knuckles were white. "Sean was shot by arrows. Arrows bought by Briggs," Tahan said. "Men hired by Briggs, some white, some Mexican, some of my people who had lost their souls to whiskey and hunger. They dressed as warriors. They attacked the wagon, but the order came from the man in the blue coat." Tahan pushed himself up on one elbow, ignoring the blood that began to seep through the fresh stitches. "I was the scout," he said. "I told Briggs the canyon was dangerous." He smiled. "He sent your husband into the kill zone. When the shooting started, I tried to turn the wagon. A soldier knocked me from my horse. When I woke up, the gold was gone. The men were dead, and Briggs was writing his report." Nora looked from the book to the man. 2 narratives were colliding in her head like freight trains. For 2 years, she had wrapped herself in the blanket of her husband's heroism. He had died defending civilization against savagery. It was a clean story. It was a story that made sense of her grief. Now, this bleeding man was telling her that Sean was just a line item in a ledger, that he was murdered for $20 and a promotion. "Why do you have this?" she asked, tapping the book. "I went back," Tahan said. 3 nights ago, I went to the agency office. I took the money he stole. I took the book that names his sins. And now he hunts me. Captain Briggs. He is coming," Tahan said. "He knows I have the book. He knows I can hang him with it. He will burn this whole territory to find me." Nora stood up. She closed the book. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet barn. She looked at the photo of Sean she kept in her mind, smiling. Young, trusting. Then she looked at the ledger, then at the Comanche. She should shoot him. It would be safer. Briggs was the law. Briggs was in the army. If she sheltered this man, she was an accomplice to theft and treason. But the handwriting, it was Briggs's signature. She had seen it on Sean's discharge papers. She had seen it on the letter of condolence. Nora Callahan walked over to the stall. Tahan tensed, waiting for the bullet. Instead, Nora leaned down and picked up the whiskey bottle. She shoved the cork back in. "You stay," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. 2 days. The storm will last that long, and you need that long to be able to sit on a horse without falling off. Tahan watched her. And then you go. She said, "You take your money, and you get off my land." "But the book," she held the ledger against her chest. "The book stays with me. That book is my life," Tahan said. "It is the only reason I am still breathing. It is the only reason I am not pulling this trigger," Nora countered. "I don't trust you, Elias Ward, or Tahan, or whoever you are, but I know how to read, and I want to know why my husband is dead." She turned to leave. Tahan called out, "If Briggs finds me here, he will kill you too. He leaves no witnesses." Nora stopped at the door. She looked back, her silhouette framed by the lantern light. The wind battered the wood, screaming to get in. "Let him come," she said. "My husband was a good shot. He taught me well." She stepped out into the night, sliding the heavy bar back into place. Inside the barn, Tahan sank back into the straw. His side burned with the fire of the whiskey and the needle, but his mind was colder than the storm. He listened to the sound of her footsteps fading. He looked at the empty spot where the ledger had been. He had traded his shield for a bandage. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in sand and ice. But inside the barn, and inside the small house where a widow sat reading by a flickering lamp, the truth was beginning to bleed out, drop by drop, staining everything it touched. The dawn broke not with sunlight, but with a reluctant, bruising gray that seeped through the cracks in the barn wood. The wind had lost its murderous scream, settling into a low, mournful howl that rattled the loose shingles, but no longer threatened to tear the roof from its beams. Tahan woke to the smell of horses and damp straw. The pain in his side was a sharp, hot companion that greeted him before he even opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the ranch. He heard the metallic screech of a water pump handle, the cluck of chickens venturing out into the mud, and the heavy, purposeful boots of the woman, Nora Callahan. He could have stayed in the straw. He had paid for the right to lie there, but Tahan of the Windwolf Band did not take charity, and the coins he had placed on the dirt floor felt insufficient for the debt of silence she was keeping. He forced himself up. The world tilted and spun, black spots dancing in his vision. But he gritted his teeth until the horizon of the barn steadied. He checked his side. The stitches held, angry and red against his skin. He pulled the oversized union coat back on, buttoning it to hide the bandage and the scars, and stepped out into the gray morning. Nora was by the woodpile, struggling with a piece of knotted oak that refused to yield to her axe. She swung with determination, but the blade bounced off the hard grain. Tahan approached silently. The dog, Buster, lifted his head from the porch and gave a low, warning growl, but he did not charge. Nora turned, startled, her grip tightening on the axe handle. "You should be resting," she said, her voice sharp with the residual tension of the night before. "Or leaving." "The storm is not done," Tahan said, looking at the heavy belly of the clouds in the west. "And neither is the wood." He held out his hand. Nora hesitated, then surrendered the axe. Tahan set a log on the block. He did not swing with the frantic energy she had used. He waited, finding the weakness in the wood, the natural line where the grain wanted to part, with a sharp, fluid motion that utilized his shoulders rather than his injured side. He brought the axe down. The wood split cleanly with a satisfying crack. He worked for an hour. He chopped wood until a neat stack stood against the wall. He fixed the hinge on the corral gate that had been banging all night. He drew water for the horses. He worked until sweat slicked his hair and his breath came in short, painful gasps. But he did not stop until the immediate chores were done. Nora watched him from the kitchen window while she kneaded dough. She watched the way he moved economical, silent, enduring. He was useful. That was a dangerous thing to admit. When he finished, he knelt by the water trough to wash his face. Then, he did something that made Nora's hands freeze in the dough. He took a pinch of cornmeal from his pocket where he had gotten it, she did not know, and scattered it to the four winds. He knelt low, his forehead touching the muddy earth, and spoke words in a language that sounded like water flowing over stones. It was a prayer, a heathen prayer on her Christian land. She wiped her hands on her apron and marched out to the porch. "We do not do that here," she called out. Tahan stood up slowly, wiping mud from his forehead. "Do what?" "Pray to dirt," she said, gesturing vaguely. "To spirits. This is a Christian home." Tahan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The dirt feeds the grass feeds the horse." "The horse carries the man. Why should the dirt not be thanked?" "Because it is dirt," Nora snapped. "Come inside. The stew is hot. You eat, then you rest. I want you strong enough to ride out tomorrow." Tahan followed her into the house. It was the first time he had stepped past the threshold. The warmth of the hearth hit him, carrying the scent of baking bread and rabbit stew. But as he stepped further into the room, the warmth evaporated from his blood. On the wall, above the mantelpiece, was a shrine, a folded American flag, encased in a glass box, a cavalry saber, and a photograph of a man with a thick mustache and eager eyes, wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Tahan stopped. He felt the phantom itch of old wounds. That uniform. He had seen men in that uniform burn the lodges of his people. He had seen them shoot horses for sport. He had worn a version of it himself, serving as a scout, thinking he could change things from the inside, only to be used as a tool for their conquest. Nora saw him staring at Sean's picture. She saw the muscle in his jaw jump. "That is my husband," she said defensively. "Sean, he was a brave man." "He was a soldier," Tahan said, the word tasting of ash. "He protected this territory," Nora said, stepping between Tahan and the photograph. "He protected people like me." "And who protected people like me from him?" Tahan asked softly. The silence that stretched between them was tighter than a bowstring. Nora looked at the savage in her kitchen, and Tahan looked at the widow of his enemy. The stew bubbled in the pot, indifferent to history. "Sit," Nora commanded, pointing to the rough wooden table. "Eat. Politics does not fill an empty belly." They ate in silence, the only sound the scraping of spoons against wooden bowls. The truce was broken at midday by the sound of wheels churning through mud. Tahan vanished. He did not run. He simply dissolved into the shadows of the barn loft before the wagon even crested the hill. Nora wiped her hands on a rag and went to the porch, the Henry rifle leaning casually against the doorframe. It was the Alvarez's. Diego and Maria sat on the bench of their battered buckboard, huddled under wool blankets. They were good neighbors, the kind who minded their own business but never let a woman starve. "Buenos dias, Nora," Diego called out, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "We brought the eggs, and Maria made butter." Nora walked out to meet them, forcing a smile. "You two shouldn't be out in this muck. The roads are a river." "The roads are bad," Maria said, handing Nora a basket covered in cloth. Her eyes were dark and serious. "But the news is worse. We thought you should know." "Know what?" Nora felt a cold prickle at the base of her spine. "Soldiers," Diego said, his voice dropping. "In town. A whole troop of them. Not regular army, but irregulars. Scouts. They wear blue, but they look like wolves." "Who leads them?" Nora asked, though she already knew. "A man named Briggs." Diego said, "Captain Briggs. He was buying rounds at the saloon. He is asking questions." "Nora, he is looking for a runaway scout. A Comanche named Elias. He says the Indians stole the army payroll and killed a white officer." Nora's grip on the basket tightened until the wicker creaked. "Is that so?" "They are checking the homesteads," Maria added, leaning forward. "They say that Elias is dangerous. A mad dog. Briggs said if anyone hides him, they will burn the roof over their heads. We just wanted you to be careful. Nora, you are alone out here. I am always careful, Nora said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Thank you, Diego, Maria. You get home safe. She watched them drive away, the wagon wheels slicing deep ruts into the mud. When they were gone, she turned back to the house. She felt the weight of the ledger book hidden under her mattress. She felt the presence of the man in her barn. She should tell him to leave. Right now. If Briggs came here and found him, she would lose everything. Her land, her home, her life. The town already looked at her with pity and suspicion, a woman living alone, refusing to sell. If she was caught sheltering a cop killer, she would be a pariah. But then she remembered the ledger. Expenditure $20 to acting parties for staging. Sean hadn't died for his country. He had died for Samuel Briggs' retirement fund. If she sent Tahan out now, Briggs would catch him, the ledger would disappear, and the truth about Sean would be buried forever in the Texas mud. Nora tried to work off her fear. She pulled on her boots and went to check the herd. The storm had scattered the cattle, driving them into the brush of the creek bed for shelter. The creek, usually a dry gash in the earth, was running high and brown, swollen with runoff. Nora counted the heads. She was missing a calf. She heard the bleeding downstream. She found the calf mired in a sinkhole of clay mud near the bank. It was a spring calf, white-faced and terrified, sunk up to its belly. Nora slid down the embankment, mud coating her skirts. She grabbed the calf by the neck and pulled. "Come on, you stupid beast," she gritted out. The calf bawled and thrashed, sinking deeper. Nora pulled until her shoulders burned. The mud held fast, a suction cup of wet earth. She slipped, falling to her knees in the slime. The water was rising. If she couldn't get it out, the calf would drown or die of exposure. Damn it, she screamed at the sky. She was alone, always alone. Then a rope hissed through the air. A loop of braided rawhide settled gently over the calf's neck and one foreleg. The rope pulled taut, not with a jerk, but with a steady, increasing pressure. Nora looked up. Tahan stood on the bank above her. He was pale, his face gray with pain, favoring his left side heavily. But his hands on the rope were sure. "Guide the legs," he called down. "Do not pull. Lift." Nora scrambled up, getting her hands under the calf's brisket. Tahan leaned back, using his good shoulder and the leverage of his body weight. He made a clicking sound with his tongue, a soft, rhythmic noise. "Now," he said. He pulled. Nora lifted. The mud gave a wet, sucking sound of defeat, and the calf popped free, sliding onto the firmer ground of the bank. It scrambled up, shaking itself, and trotted toward its mother. Nora stayed on her knees for a moment, breathing hard, covered in muck. Tahan coiled the rope. He swayed slightly, his hand going to his side where the stitches pulled. "You shouldn't be out here," Nora said. Climbing up the bank, she wiped mud from her face. "You'll tear yourself open," the calf cried, Tahan said simply. He looked at the animal, his eyes soft. He reached out and touched the calf's flank as it passed, muttering a word in Comanche. Nora watched him. This was the killer Briggs described. The mad dog. He stood shivering in the wind, bleeding, risking his safety to save a $10 calf because it was crying. "You have a way with them," she said quietly. "Animals do not lie." Tahan said, "They do not sign treaties they do not mean to keep." He handed her the rope. Their fingers brushed. His hand was rough, warm, and calloused. For a moment, the barrier between them, the wall of race and history and war, thinned. He was just a man who knew how to throw a rope. She was just a woman trying to save her herd. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, turned, and limped back toward the barn. That evening, the cold drove them both close to the hearth. Nora did not send him back to the barn. She told herself it was because she needed to keep an eye on him. But the truth was, the house felt less empty with him there. They sat on the rug before the fire, eating the remains of the stew. The wind whistled in the chimney. A lonely sound. "My father," Nora began, staring into the flames. "He died in a ditch in County Cork. His mouth was green from eating grass because there were no potatoes." Taihan looked at her over his bowl. "We came here for land," she continued, her voice low. "That is all the Irish want, a piece of dirt that no lord can take away. When I saw this place, the sky was so big it hurt your eyes. I thought I could breathe." "Hunger has many shapes," Taihan said softly. "When I was 12 winters old, the soldiers came to the Pease River. My father was away hunting. My mother, she hid me under a buffalo robe. She told me to be still as a stone. He put the bowl down. His eyes were far away, reflecting the firelight. I heard the rifles. I heard the screams. When I came out, the lodges were burning. The buffalo meat we had dried for winter was burning. My mother was gone. They took the food. They took the women. They left us hungry." Nora looked at him. She saw the boy in the man's face. She saw the echo of her own father's starvation in his story. They were enemies by blood, perhaps, but they were kin in loss. "We are just two people trying to keep warm in a world that wants to freeze us," Nora said. Taihan looked at her. "Yes, but the fire is burning low." The next morning brought a false spring. The sun broke through, bright and blinding. Though the air remained crisp, it also brought misses. Holloway. Nora saw the carriage coming down the lane and cursed under her breath. Mrs. Holloway was the head of the church charity committee, a woman who wore her piety like a suit of armor and wielded gossip like a saber. "Hide!" Nora hissed to Taihan, who was repairing the porch railing. "I am not a rat to scurry," Taihan said, driving a nail with a single blow. "No, you are a target," Nora said. "Get in the barn, now." He moved, but not fast enough. As Mrs. Holloway's carriage pulled up, Taihan was just slipping through the barn doors. The older woman's sharp eyes, honed by years of spotting sin at 100 yards, caught the movement. "Nora, dear Mrs." Holloway called out, climbing down from her carriage. She held a basket of muffins covered in gingham. "We were so worried about you in the storm, living all alone out here." "I'm fine, Martha," Nora said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The house held, Mrs." Holloway's gaze drifted to the barn. "I saw someone, a man. Do you have help, Nora?" Nora felt the sweat prickle on her neck. "A hired hand," she lied. "Just passing through. He worked for a meal and a bed in the loft." "He looked dark, Mrs." Holloway said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Like a Mexican, or worse." "He is a hard worker," Nora said, her voice tight. "Mrs." Holloway stepped closer, smelling of lavender water and judgment. "You must be careful. Nora, a woman of your standing, a widow of a hero. People talk. It is not proper to have strange men on the property, especially those of that persuasion. You have a reputation to maintain. For Sean's sake." Nora felt a flash of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "Sean is dead. Martha, the fence needed fixing. Reputation does not keep the coyotes out." "Mrs." Holloway stiffened. "I see. Well, I just thought you should know what the town might say. We only want what is best for you." She shoved the basket of muffins at Nora and climbed back into her carriage. As she drove away, she looked back at the barn with a look of pure suspicion. Nora stood on the porch, clutching the basket. She felt dirty. She felt angry. And for the first time, she felt a fierce, protective instinct for the man hiding in her barn. He was a savage. Yes, but he had saved her calf. He had shared his hunger. Mrs. Holloway had only shared muffins and judgment. Taihan stepped out of the barn when the carriage was a speck on the horizon. He did not look at Nora. He looked past her, toward the east. He stood very still, like a deer scenting the wind. "What is it?" Nora asked. "Coming down the steps?" Taihan pointed, far in the distance, miles away across the flat table of the plains. A cloud of dust was rising. It was not the wind. It was too focused. It was the dust of many horses. riding hard. "They are coming," Tahan said. His voice was calm, the calm of a man who has accepted his fate. "Briggs. Briggs. The trackers. They have found the trail." Tahan turned to look at her. The connection they had built by the fire, the shared understanding of the mud and the work, was suddenly fragile as glass. "If I stay," Tahan said, "they burn this house. They hurt you to get to me." "And if you go?" Nora asked. "I drew them away," he said, "into the canyons, where the horse cannot go." "You are wounded," Nora said. "You cannot outrun them." "I do not need to outrun them," Tahan said, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "I only need to make them bleed enough to stop." He looked at her, and for the first time, Nora saw the warrior. Not the victim, but she also saw the man who didn't want to die. "Get your horse," Nora said, her voice trembling. "But do not ride south. Ride north, to the ridge." "Why?" "Because," she said, looking at the approaching dust, "I am not done with you yet, and neither is the truth." The morning light was deceptive. It painted the Llano Estacado in soft hues of lavender and sage, hiding the brutality of the land under a veneer of peace. Tahan stood in the shadowed recess of the barn, his movement stiff but determined. The fever had receded to a dull throb in his shoulder, a manageable fire compared to the inferno of the previous night. He knelt by the grain bin, prying up a loose floorboard with the edge of his knife into the dark cavity beneath. He dropped the heavy leather pouch containing the gold and silver, the blood money stolen from Captain Briggs. He replaced the board and scattered straw over it, obscuring the disturbance. Nora Callahan stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him. She looked tired, the circles under her eyes dark against her pale skin, but her posture was as rigid as a fence post. "You are leaving the money," she said. It was not a question. "If they catch me," Tahan said, standing up and brushing the dust from his knees, "they will find the man, but not the prize. If they kill me, the money is yours. It will buy hay for the winter. It will buy a new roof." "I told you I do not want that money," Nora snapped, though the heat in her voice was dampened by worry. "It is cursed. Gold has no soul," Tahan replied, tightening the cinch on his piebald mare. "Only men have curses." He led the horse out into the yard. The wind had died down to a breeze, but the air tasted metallic, like iron left in the sun. He swung into the saddle, gritting his teeth as his injured side protested the movement. He looked down at Nora. She looked small against the vast backdrop of the plains, a solitary figure in a calico dress fighting a war she had not started. "If you stay," Nora said, her voice tight, "you bring the lightning down on this house. That is why I go." Tahan said, "I ride east. Briggs will follow the tracks. He will follow the blood. He will chase the wolf and leave the sheep alone." "Do not call me a sheep. Elias," she warned, using the name the soldiers gave him, though it sounded different on her tongue now. Less like an accusation, more like a claim. "Ride north to the ridge, as you said," Tahan instructed. "Do not be here when the dust rises." He turned the mare's head toward the open plain. He did not look back. He could not afford to. If he looked back, he might see the way her hand half raised to stop him, or the way her eyes held a fear that was not for herself, but for him. And Tahan of the Windwolf Band could not afford to have a heart that looked backward. He rode for 2 hours. The sun climbed higher, baking the mud into a hard crust. Tahan kept to the low ground, using the arroyos and washes to hide his silhouette. He was making for the canyonlands to the east, a maze of red rock where a man could vanish for a lifetime. But Briggs was not a fool, and his hired guns were not soldiers who marched in lines. They were trackers who smelled desperation. Tahan crested a small rise and saw them. 3 riders, perhaps 4, moving in a loose formation a mile to the south. They wore the dust-colored coats of the range, but the sun glinted off rifles that were too new, too clean for common drifters. One of them shouted. A puff of white smoke bloomed from a saddle gun. The sound of the shot arrived a second later, a flat crack that rolled over the prairie. Tahan spurred the mare. She was tired, but she had heart. She surged forward, her hooves pounding the hard earth. Another shot, then another. Tahan felt a sudden, sharp sting on his thigh, as if a hornet had struck him. He looked down to see a tear in his trousers and a fresh line of bright red blood welling up. A graze, a warning. He pulled the mare hard to the left, sliding into a dry wash. He was cut off. The riders were between him and the canyons. They were herding him, pushing him west, pushing him back. He had no choice. To ride into the open was death. To fight 3 men with a bolt-action rifle and half a box of ammunition was suicide. He needed a fortress. He needed walls. He turned the mare back toward the setting sun, back toward the single point of light in the emptiness. The storm returned in the late afternoon, not with wind this time, but with a heavy, driving rain that turned the world into a gray blur. Nora was in the kitchen, cleaning the Henry rifle, when she heard the frantic whinny of a horse. She ran to the door, throwing it open just as a shape lurched out of the downpour and collapsed in the mud of the yard. It was Tahan. He had slid from the saddle, his legs finally giving out. He was covered in mud, his face a mask of exhaustion, fresh blood mingling with the rain on his leg. "You fool!" Nora cried, running out into the rain. She grabbed him by the arm, trying to haul him up. "I told you to go. Why did you come back?" Tahan gasped, leaning heavily on her. He fumbled at his belt, his fingers slick with rain and blood. He pulled out the leather pouch he had retrieved it from the barn before collapsing. Or perhaps he had never left it. He threw it onto the wooden planks of the porch. The heavy bag landed with a wet, solid thud that shook the boards. "I pay," Tahan shouted over the rain, his voice raw. "I pay for shelter 1 more night." He swayed, gripping Nora's shoulder to keep from falling into the muck. "If morning comes, and I am alive, I go," he rasped. "If not, the money. It builds you a roof. It buys the land." Nora looked at the bag of gold lying in the rain. It was a fortune. It was enough to pay off the bank, to buy more cattle, to hire men to build a fence that stretched to the horizon. It was the price of her husband's life. She looked at Tahan. He was shaking, his eyes wild with pain and defiance. He was trying to buy his life with the very thing that had destroyed hers. Nora let go of his arm. She took a step back. Then, with a savage kick of her boot, she sent the heavy leather bag skidding across the porch. It hit the wall and lay there, ignored. "I do not want your blood money," she screamed, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "I do not want the coins that killed Sean." Tahan stared at her, confused, his defenses crumbling. Then, "I have nothing. You have a pulse," Nora said, grabbing him by the front of his sodden coat. "And you are not dying in the mud on my doorstep. Get inside." She did not steer him toward the barn. She dragged him, stumbling and coughing, up the steps and through the front door of her home. The warmth of the house hit them like a physical blow. Nora kicked the door shut against the rain. She guided Tahan to the rug before the hearth and pushed him down. "Stay," she commanded. She moved with a frantic energy. She put a large copper kettle on the stove. She pulled the curtains tight. Then she went to the bedroom, the room she had not shared with anyone for 2 years, and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She pulled out a shirt, a flannel shirt, soft and worn, checkered in blue and gray. Sean's shirt. She held it for a moment, burying her face in the fabric, inhaling the faint, fading scent of tobacco and bay rum. Then she walked back to the main room. Tahan was shivering violently. The fever was spiking again. "Get those clothes off," Nora said, setting the shirt on a chair. "They are wet and filthy." Tahan looked at her, then at the shirt. He hesitated. "I'm not asking. Elias," she said softly. "I am telling." She brought the tin tub from the pantry and set it by the fire. She poured the hot water, mixing it with cold from the bucket until it was steaming but bearable. Tahan stripped off the heavy coat, then the buckskin tunic. He struggled with his boots. Nora knelt and pulled them off for him. When he stood to remove his trousers, she turned her back, busying herself with finding a bar of soap and a rough towel. She heard the splash of water as he lowered himself into the tub. "Turn around," she said. "I need to clean the wound on your leg." When she turned, the breath caught in her throat. He was sitting in the tub, his knees drawn up, his head bowed. The firelight danced over his skin, turning the copper tone to gold, but it was his back that held her gaze. She had seen the scars in the barn, but in the dim lantern light, they had been suggestions. Here, in the clarity of the hearth, they were a history book written in flesh. There were the lash marks, silvery and old, crossing his shoulder blades like a grid. There was a jagged, puckered star on his lower back, shrapnel from a cannon shell. Perhaps there was a long, thin white line running down his arm, a knife cut from a fight long ago. Nora approached him slowly. She took the soap and the cloth. She knelt behind the tub. "Lean forward," she whispered. She touched the soapy cloth to his back. Tahan flinched, his muscles bunching tight. "Easy," she soothed. "It is just soap." She washed him. She traced the lines of the whip marks with the cloth. She realized, with a sudden, piercing clarity, that Sean had died a sudden, violent death. But this man had been dying by inches his whole life. Sean had medals in a box. Tahan had his medals carved into his skin. "They whipped you," she said, her voice trembling. "The army? The school," Tahan said, his voice low and vibrating against the rim of the tub. "Before I was a scout, they tried to wash the Indian out of me. They said the savage lives in the skin, so they tried to cut the skin off." Nora's hand stilled on his shoulder. She looked at the scar. It was a brutality she could not imagine, inflicted on a child. "And did they," she asked, "did they wash it out?" Tahan turned his head slightly. His dark eyes met hers. "The skin heals," he said. "The blood remembers." Nora rinsed the cloth. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. She was washing the body of a man who was supposed to be her enemy. In the kitchen of the husband he had inadvertently helped kill. And yet, she did not feel hate. She felt a profound, aching sorrow. "Stand up," she said hoarsely. "I have to dress the leg." He stood, water sluicing off his lean frame. Nora handed him the towel, keeping her eyes on his face, though the pull of his physical presence was undeniable. He dried himself and put on Sean's shirt. It was a little loose in the shoulders, but it fit. He looked less like a warrior now and more like a man, a tired, broken man standing in her kitchen. That night, the storm battered the walls, isolating them from the world. They sat on the rug in front of the fireplace. Nora poured 2 glasses of whiskey. She handed one to Tahan. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt through her that was sharper than the whiskey. "Tell me," Nora said, staring into the amber liquid. "Tell me exactly how he died. Do not spare me." Tahan took a long drink. He set the glass down. "The sun was high," he began. "The canyon was red, like the color of rust. I told Briggs the shadows were too deep." He laughed. He signaled the wagons forward. Nora listened. He spoke of the dust, the smell of the mules, the sudden, cracking sound of the first rifle shot from the rim. He spoke of how Sean had stood up on the wagon box, trying to return fire, trying to protect the payroll. "He did not run," Tahan said softly. "He stood tall. He was shouting orders to his men. A bullet took him in the chest. He fell backward. It was quick. Nora, he did not suffer the fear of the end. He only knew the fight." Nora let the tears fall. She had held them back for 2 years. She had been strong for the town, strong for the bank, strong for herself. But hearing it now, knowing that Sean had died brave but betrayed, the dam broke. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Tahan moved. He did not think, he simply acted. He reached out and pulled her toward him. Nora did not resist. She collapsed against him, burying her face in the flannel shirt, Sean's shirt, worn by Tahan. She smelled the soap, the whiskey, and the underlying scent of pine and smoke that was Tahan himself. He held her. He stroked her hair with a hand that had killed men and broken horses, but now touched her with the reverence of a prayer. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I am sorry I could not stop the wheel." Nora pulled back. Her face was wet, her eyes searching for him. She saw the regret in his eyes, deep and genuine. She saw the loneliness that mirrored her own. "It wasn't you," she whispered. "It was a lie." She looked at his mouth. It was a hard mouth, unsmiling, but soft at the corners. The distance between them vanished. Nora leaned in. Tahan met her halfway. The kiss was not tentative. It tasted of whiskey and salt tears. It was desperate, a collision of two people who had been starving for touch. Tahan's hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Nora's hands gripped the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. They sank back onto the rug. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was not gentle loving. It was urgent. It was a reclaiming of life in the face of death. Tahan moved over her, mindful of his weight but consumed by the need to be near her. Nora arched against him, her hands exploring the ridges of scars on his back, her fingers tracing the map of his pain and turning it into a map of pleasure. For a moment, there was no Comanche and no white woman, no widow and no scout. There was only skin and heat, and the frantic, affirming rhythm of breath and heartbeats. Later, they lay tangled together under a wool blanket, the fire dying down to embers. Tahan lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling. Nora rested her head on his uninjured shoulder, her hand flat against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "You tried to pay me," Nora murmured, her voice sleepy and thick. "You threw that gold at me like it could fix the hole in the world." Tahan turned his head to look at her. "That is all I had?" "No," Nora said. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. Her hair hung loose around her face, softening her features. "You have more than that." She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "You don't pay for shelter with gold. Tahan, not here, not with me." "How then?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You pay with the truth," she said. "You pay by standing up. Tomorrow, we will go to the sheriff. We take the ledger. We take the gold, and we tell them what Briggs did." Tahan stiffened. "They will hang me before I can speak." "Not if I am standing next to you," Nora said fiercely. "Not if we stand together. That is the price. Tahan, that is the cost of this bed. You have to be willing to live for something, not just survive it." Tahan looked at her. He felt a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the noose. He had spent his life running, fighting, hiding. He had been gasping for air, for survival. Now, looking into the eyes of this woman who had every reason to hate him, he realized he was gasping for something else. He was gasping for redemption. "I will stand," he whispered. "I will stand with you." Nora smiled, a small, sad, brave thing. She kissed his forehead. "Then sleep," she said. "We have a long ride in the morning." They settled down, wrapping their arms around each other against the encroaching chill. Tahan closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he did not dream of fire. He dreamed of a gate that was open, and a path that led home. Outside, the rain stopped. The silence of the plains returned, vast and indifferent. But in the distance, far down the muddy track that led to the ranch, the sound of hoofbeats began to rhythmic thud against the earth. They were faint at first, then growing louder, a drumbeat of doom approaching in the dark. Briggs was coming, and this time, he was not bringing a ledger. He was bringing a war. The morning air was brittle, holding the tension of a drawn bowstring. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a bruised purple that was slowly bleaching into a hard, unforgiving blue. The mud in the yard was thick and cloying, churning under the boots of Nora Callahan as she tightened the cinch on the bay gelding. Her hands were steady, but her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Beside her, Diego Alvarez adjusted the bridle of his own mule, his face grim. Maria stood on the porch, clutching a shawl tight around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed over the edge of the world. "The ledger is in the saddlebag," Nora whispered to Tahan, who stood in the shadows of the barn door, checking the load in his borrowed revolver. "Along with the money," If they come before we leave, you take the back trail through the creek bed. Do not wait for me." Tahan looked at her. He was wearing clean clothes, a pair of canvas trousers that had belonged to Sean, and a fresh flannel shirt, but he still wore his moccasins. And his hair was tied back with a strip of rawhide. He looked like a man caught between two lives. "I will not leave you," Tahan said. His voice was low, vibrating with the same stubbornness that had kept him alive through the winter. "We ride together, or we stand together." "This is not a debate, Elias," Nora snapped, though the heat in her words was born of fear, not anger. "If Briggs finds you here," Buster, the mongrel dog, let out a low, rumbling growl that started deep in his chest and ended in a sharp, jagged bark. He ran to the fence line, the hair on his back standing up like quills. Nora froze. She looked to the east. The sound came first, a dull thrumming that vibrated through the soles of her boots. Then came the dust, a low cloud kicking up against the rising sun. And finally, the shapes. They were not the ragtag drifters of the day before. This was a column. 8 men riding abreast, their horses moving with the discipline of a cavalry unit. At the center rode a man in a blue officer's coat with gold epaulets that caught the light. "Too late," Diego murmured. Reaching for the shotgun, he had leaned against the wagon wheel. "Put it down! Diego!" Nora commanded, her voice turning cold and hard. "We cannot fight a squad in the open. Tahan, get back! Deep back!" Tahan did not argue. He melted into the darkness of the barn's interior, pulling the heavy doors shut until only a sliver of light remained. Nora stepped onto the porch, grabbing the Henry rifle. She did not raise it, but she held it across her body, a clear signal that she was not a woman to be trifled with. The riders slowed as they approached the gate. They fanned out, forming a semicircle that blocked the exit. The horses snorted, steam rising from their nostrils in the chill air. Captain Samuel Briggs rode forward. He was a handsome man in a terrifying way, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that were the pale, watery blue of a winter sky. He smiled as he tipped his hat, a gesture of civility that felt like a knife blade sliding between ribs. "Mrs. Callahan," Briggs said. His voice was rich and baritone, the voice of a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed. "A fine morning, is it not, though I see you are prepared for a journey?" "I am going to town, Captain," Nora said, not moving. "Is there a reason you have brought a parade to my doorstep?" Briggs chuckled. A dry sound. He looked at Diego and Maria, dismissing them with a flick of his gaze, before returning his attention to Nora. "We are here for your protection. Madam, my scouts tell me there is a dangerous element in the area. A renegade Comanche, a killer. We tracked him near here." Briggs leaned forward on his saddle horn, the leather creaking. "We believe he may be looking for shelter, or hostages. I have seen no one." Nora lied. Her face was a mask of stone. "Only my neighbors." "Is that so?" Briggs looked at the house, then at the barn. His eyes lingered on the fresh mud tracks leading into the stable. "You know, Mrs. Callahan, this is prime land. It sits right at the mouth of the valley. With the railroad expansion talk starting in Austin next month, a man could make a fortune here, if the land were available." Nora's grip on the rifle tightened. "My land is not for sale, Captain, not to the railroad, and not to you." Briggs sighed, a theatrical gesture of disappointment. "A pity. Obstinacy is a dangerous quality in a widow, but duty comes first. We need to search the premises. For your safety. Of course, if this savage is hiding in your hayloft, I would never forgive myself if he slit your throat in the night." "You have no warrant," Nora said. "I am the Indian agent for this territory," Briggs said, his voice dropping the veneer of charm. "And under the martial law of the frontier, suspicion is all the warrant I need. Boys, check the house. And the barn." 4 men dismounted. They were hard-faced men, mercenaries dressed in dusty trail clothes but carrying army-issue carbines. "No!" Nora shouted, raising the barrel of Henry. Simultaneously, 2 of the riders remaining on horseback leveled their pistols at her. The click of hammers cocking echoed across the yard. "Please, Mrs. Callahan," Briggs said smoothly. "Do not force my hand. I would hate to see a white woman hurt. Put the gun down." Nora looked at the barrels pointed at her. She looked at Diego, who was trembling but holding his ground. She slowly lowered the rifle. The men stormed past her into the house. They could be heard overturning furniture, opening cupboards, the sound of glass breaking. Briggs watched Nora closely, looking for a flinch, a sign of weakness. One of the men came out of the house. He was holding the heavy leather saddlebag Nora had packed. He upended it on the porch. The clothes spilled out, and with them, the black ledger book. Briggs's face went rigid. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of predatory calculation. "Well now," Briggs said softly. "What have we here?" He dismounted and walked up the steps, his spurs jingling. He picked up the ledger. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages. He saw his own signature. He saw the dates. He saw the damning evidence of 5 years of theft, murder, and treason. He looked up at Nora. There was no charm left now, only the cold, dead stare of a shark. "You have been busy," Briggs said. "Did he give this to you? The savage?" "He gave me the truth," Nora said, her voice shaking with rage. "I read the entry. Briggs, November 12th, 1873. You staged the attack. You hired the men who killed my husband." Briggs closed the book with a snap. He looked around the yard, ensuring his men were listening, ensuring they understood the stakes. "Sean Callahan was a fool," Briggs said, his voice flat. "He wanted to play the hero. He wanted to file reports about irregularities in the supply chain. He was going to ruin a very profitable arrangement I had with the Comancheros. He had to be removed. The fact that I could blame it on the Quahati band and get funding for a new fort was just efficiency." Nora felt the breath leave her body. For 2 years, she had hated a faceless enemy. She had hated a race. And all the while, the monster had been wearing a blue coat and smiling at her at church picnics. "You murdered him," she whispered. "For money." "And now," Briggs said, drawing his heavy cavalry saber with a metallic hiss, "I am going to have to murder you. A tragedy. Really. The widow Callahan. Killed by the same renegade Comanche who killed her husband. A poetic end. My men will burn the house to hide the evidence." He stepped toward her, the blade gleaming in the sun. "I think not," a voice called out. The barn doors exploded outward. Tahan did not hide in the shadows. He stepped into the light. The Winchester rifle he had taken from the saddlebag raised and locked against his shoulder. He did not look like a broken refugee anymore. He stood with his feet planted wide, his chest exposed, the scars of his past visible under the open collar of Sean's shirt. "Elias," Briggs sneered, though he took a step back, putting a porch pillar between himself and the rifle. "I wondered when you would show your face." "My name is Tahan," the Comanche said. His voice carried across the yard, clear and strong. "I was your dog. Briggs, I hunted for you. I bled for you. But a dog eventually bites the hand that beats it. Kill him," Briggs screamed at his men. "Kill them all!" The yard erupted. Tahan moved before the order was fully shouted. He did not stand still to be a target. He dove to his right, rolling over the hard-packed earth behind the water trough, just as the wood of the barn door splintered under a hail of bullets. Nora dropped to one knee. She didn't think. She just reacted. She racked the lever of the Henry rifle. A man on the left, raising a shotgun, filled her sights. She pulled the trigger. The man spun backward, clutching his shoulder, his weapon falling into the mud. "Diego, the horses!" Tahan shouted from behind the trough. Diego Alvarez, showing a courage that belied his age, fired his shotgun into the air. The blast spooked the posse's horses. They reared and kicked, throwing the aim of the riders and creating a wall of chaotic flesh between the shooters and the house. Tahan popped up. He fired 1, 2, 3 shots. Fast, precise. One of the riders tumbled from his saddle. Another clutched his thigh, cursing. Tahan was not shooting to kill. He was shooting to disable, to break the line. He vaulted over the trough, running low toward the fence line, drawing the fire away from Nora. "Get him! Ignore the woman! Get the Indian!" Briggs roared, hiding behind the bulk of the wagon. Bullets chewed up the ground around Tahan's feet. He felt the wind of a slug pass his ear. He dove behind the heavy oak posts of the corral. He was in his element now. This was not a drill on a parade ground. This was a skirmish, and he fought with the fluid, improvisational style of the Windwolf people. Nora crawled to the edge of the porch, using the railing for cover. She saw a man aiming at Tahan's exposed flank. She took a breath, held it, and fired. The man's hat flew off, and he ducked, terrified. "Covering you!" she screamed. Tahan looked at her. Across the dust and the noise, their eyes locked. They were a team, the widow and the warrior, fighting back to back. Briggs saw his men faltering. The surprise of the resistance, combined with the chaos of the horses, was breaking their nerves. He realized that if he didn't end this now, he would lose. He holstered his saber and drew his Colt revolver. He didn't aim at Tahan. He aimed at Nora. Tahan saw the movement. He broke cover. He didn't shoot. His rifle was empty. He dropped it and sprinted across the open yard, a blur of motion. He tackled Briggs just as the captain pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, smashing a window pane above Nora's head. The two men hit the mud with a bone-jarring thud. It was a brawl of desperation. Briggs was larger, heavier, fueled by the rage of a man seeing his empire crumble. Tahan was wounded, lighter, but driven by a lifetime of survival. They rolled in the muck. Briggs struck Tahan in his injured side. Tahan gasped, white light exploding behind his eyes, but he did not let go. He drove his knee into Briggs's stomach. Briggs roared and brought the barrel of his pistol down on Tahan's head. Tahan saw stars. His grip loosened. Briggs shoved him off and scrambled to his feet, raising the gun for a killing shot. Tahan swept his leg out. It was a dirty move, a street fight move. He caught Briggs's ankle. The captain went down hard, the pistol flying from his hand and skidding away into the dirt. Tahan was on him instantly. He drew his knife, the heavy skinning knife Nora had sharpened the night before. He pinned Briggs to the ground, his forearm crushing the captain's throat, the tip of the blade hovering an inch from Briggs' eye. "Do it." Briggs choked out, his face purple. "Cut me! Savage, show her what you are!" The yard went silent. The gunfire stopped. The surviving mercenaries lowered their weapons, watching the two men in the mud. They were hired guns, not fanatics. They knew when a fight was over. Tahan stared down at the man who had ordered the destruction of his village, the man who had killed Sean, the man who represented everything that had been taken from him. His hand trembled. The knife wanted to drink. His blood screamed for it. Justice, revenge. It was all right there, a fraction of an inch away. He looked up. He saw Nora standing on the porch, the rifle lowered. She was watching him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. "If you stay, you are a killer," she had said. "If you stand, you are a man." Tahan took a deep breath. He pulled the knife back. "No," Tahan said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I am not the monster you made me. I am Tahan, and I leave you for the law." He stood up, backing away slowly, keeping his eyes on Briggs. "It is over." "Briggs," Tahan said, "the ledger is safe. The witnesses are here. Your war is done." Briggs sat up in the mud. He looked at his men, who were backing away. He looked at Tahan, who had granted him a mercy he did not deserve. And in that mercy, Briggs saw his total defeat, a court-martial, a hanging, the humiliation of being beaten by an Indian and a woman. "It is never done," Briggs hissed. His hand moved with the speed of a striking snake. He reached into his high cavalry boot. He pulled out a hidden derringer, a two-shot hideout gun. "Tahan!" Nora screamed. Briggs raised the small pistol, aiming at Tahan's back. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. It did not come from Tahan. Briggs jerked violently. A red flower bloomed on the chest of his blue coat. He looked down at it, confused. The derringer dropped from his fingers. He looked up at the porch. Nora Callahan stood there, the Henry rifle smoking in her hands. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, but her hands were rock steady. Briggs slumped forward. He fell face down in the mud of the ranch he had tried to steal, dead before he hit the ground. Silence descended on the yard. It was heavy and absolute. Tahan looked at Briggs' body, then up at Nora. He walked slowly toward the porch. He climbed the steps and gently took the rifle from her hands. Nora looked at him. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the horror of what she had done. I killed him, she whispered. You defended your home, Tahan said softly. You defended your life. He turned to the mercenaries who were still mounted, watching with wary eyes. Tahan picked up the ledger book from where it had fallen. He held it up. Go, he said to them. Right away, or stay and explain to the marshal why you rode with a murderer. The men looked at the dead captain. They looked at the fierce woman and the Comanche warrior. One by one, they holstered their weapons, turned their horses, and rode out, disappearing into the dust. This is my home, Nora said, her voice gaining strength, echoing the thought in her mind. She looked at the body of the man who had killed her husband. This is his land. This is our blood. Briggs, I do not give you the right to decide who lives or dies here anymore. Tahan stood beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a shield. From the north, a new sound emerged. Not the chaotic thunder of the posse, but the orderly, rhythmic trot of a disciplined column. A bugle call cut through the morning air. Diego Alvarez lowered his shotgun and crossed himself. The law, he said. Sheriff Holloway and a stern-faced U.S. Marshal rode into the yard, flanked by a dozen deputies. They stopped at the gate, taking in the scene. The dead horses, the wounded men, the body of the captain in the mud, and the two figures standing on the porch, a white woman and a Comanche man, standing shoulder to shoulder against the world. The marshal rode forward, his eyes taking in the ledger book in Tahan's hand. It seems, the marshal said, tipping his hat back, that we have missed the trial. Tahan looked at Nora. She reached out and took his hand, entwining her fingers with his. No, Marshal, Nora said. The trial is just beginning, but the verdict has already been delivered. The silence that followed the death of Captain Samuel Briggs was heavier than the storm that had battered the ranch only 2 nights before. It was a silence made of dust, gun smoke, and the collective breath of 20 men standing in a muddy yard on the Llano Estacado. Sheriff Holloway, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of dry riverbed clay, swung down from his horse. He walked slowly toward the porch, his spurs jingling with a sound that seemed too loud for the morning. Beside him walked the United States Marshal, a man named Clayton with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier to be surprised by anything. Nora Callahan lowered the Henry rifle. Her arms, which had been as steady as iron moments ago, began to tremble. She leaned the weapon against the porch railing, her fingers leaving smudges of gun oil and sweat on the wood. Tahan stood a few feet away from her. He had holstered the knife, but he did not run. He stood with his hands open at his sides, his chest heaving beneath the flannel shirt that belonged to the man whose death he had inadvertently caused. He looked at the marshal, then at the body of Briggs lying face down in the muck. Well, Marshal Clayton said, his voice scratching like dry leaves. He used the toe of his boot to turn Briggs over. The captain's eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the vast Texas sky. That is a hell of a way to resign a commission. He was going to shoot him, Nora said. Her voice was thin, brittle. He had a hideout gun in his boot. The marshal bent down. He pried the small derringer from the dead man's fingers. He straightened up, checking the load. 2 shots, Clayton muttered. Close range, nasty little thing. He looked up at Nora. Self-defense, misses. Callahan, or defense of another. I saw it. My deputies saw it. He came here to kill us, Nora said, gesturing to the yard where the remnants of Briggs' posse were retreating into the distance. their dust cloud fading. He said he was the law. He was the Indian agent. Clayton corrected. Which is a different thing entirely from the law, though some men forget the distinction. The marshal turned his gaze to Tahan. The look was not hostile, but it was measuring. It was the look a butcher gives a steer, calculating the weight. "And you," Clayton said, "you would be Elias Ward." Tahan did not flinch. "That is the name the army gave me. I am Tahan." "I have a poster in my saddlebag," the marshal said. Walking up the steps of the porch, the wooden planks creaked under his weight. "It says Elias Ward, wanted for desertion, theft of government property, and suspicion of involvement in the massacre at Sand Creek." The air in the yard shifted. The deputies behind the fence tightened their grip on their carbines. Sheriff Holloway shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Desertion," Tahan said clearly. "Yes, I left. Theft, yes, I took what was owed to the starving." "And the massacre?" Clayton asked. He stopped 2 feet from Tahan. "Did you ride with them when they burned the lodges? Did you scout for the unit that killed the women?" Nora stepped forward. "Marshal, you cannot." Tahan held up a hand to stop her. He looked Clayton in the eye. "I rode," Tahan said. "I showed them the water. I showed them the trail. They told me we were going to talk peace. When the shooting started, I fired my rifle into the air. I tried to stop the soldier next to me. He struck me with his rifle butt." Tahan touched the scar on his forehead. "But I was there. I was part of the machine. I carry that blood." "He is confessing," Sheriff Holloway said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "That makes it easy. We took him in. Hang him at the fort." "No!" Nora's scream tore through the fatalism of the moment. She threw herself between Tahan and the lawmen. "You will not touch him." "Mrs. Callahan," Holloway said, looking embarrassed. "Step aside. He is a Comanche. He is a deserter. He just admitted it." "He is the only reason any of you know the truth," Nora shouted. She grabbed the black ledger book from where Tahan had placed it on the railing. She shoved it into the marshal's chest. "Read it," she commanded. "Read November 12th, 1873. Read about the payroll wagon. Read about my husband." Marshal Clayton took the book. He opened it, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers and notes. He flipped through the pages, reading the handwriting of the dead captain. He kept good records. Clayton murmured, "I will give him that. Arrogant son of a bitch thought he was untouchable." "He killed Sean," Nora said, tears finally spilling over. "Briggs set up the ambush. He hired the men. He paid $20 for the arrows to make it look like a raid. And Tahan, Elias, he was the scout who tried to turn the wagon around. He tried to save them." The marshal looked up from the book. He looked at Tahan with new interest. "Is this true?" "Son, the book speaks," Tahan said. "Briggs sold the rifles to the bandits. He sold the beef meant for the reservation to the miners. He started wars to keep his funding. I stole the book to stop him. I came here to survive the storm. I did not know this was the house of the man who died in the canyon." "He saved my herd," Nora added, her voice fierce. "He pulled a calf from the mud when he was bleeding from a bullet wound. He fixed my barn. He protected me when Briggs came to burn this house down. If he was the monster you say he is. Marshal, why is Briggs dead, and why are you standing here alive?" The yard was quiet. The wind whispered through the high grass. Diego Alvarez stepped forward from the corner of the house, his shotgun broken open over his arm. "She speaks the truth, Marshal," Diego said. "I saw it. This man fought for her. He fought for us. Briggs. Briggs was a plague. He squeezed the Mexican farmers. He squeezed the ranchers. He called it protection, but it was theft. This man ended it. He is still an Indian," a deputy muttered from the fence. "He has still got a price on his head." Marshal Clayton closed the ledger. He tapped it against his thigh. He looked at the dead body of Briggs, then at the vast, empty horizon, and finally at Tahan. "This book," Clayton said slowly, "is a ladder. It goes high. Briggs wasn't working alone. There are suppliers in Santa Fe. Politicians in Austin, maybe even a general or two who took a cut of this beef money. He looked at Tahan. If I take you in and hang you, Elias, this book is just paper. Defense attorneys will say it is a forgery. They will say Briggs was a hero, killed by a savage and a hysterical widow. Nora bristled at the word hysterical, but she held her tongue. But, Clayton continued, if I have the man who stole it, the man who sat in the tent while the deals were made, the man who can point a finger at the partners listed in these pages, well, then I have a case. I have a hammer to break the whole ring. Tahan stood straighter. I will not go back to the cage. I will not go back to the reservation to starve. I am not offering a cage, Clayton said. I am offering a trade. You ride with me to Fort Bascom. You testify before a military tribunal. You tell them everything, every raid Briggs staged, every rifle he sold. You name names. And then, Tahan asked, you will have to serve time. Clayton said honestly, you are a deserter. The Army does not forgive that easily. Maybe 2 years, maybe 3, hard labor, but no hanging. And when you come out, you get a pardon. A full pardon. You walk away a free man. A citizen. If you want it. 3 years, Tahan whispered. It sounded like a lifetime. It is better than a rope, Holloway pointed out. Tahan looked at Nora. She was watching him, her face pale, her lips pressed together. Go, she whispered. Do it, Elias, finish it. If I go, Tahan said to the marshal, how do I know you will keep your word? How do I know I do not walk into a cell and never walk out? You don't, Clayton said. That is the gamble. But I'm a federal marshal. I don't like dirty officers. And I don't like men who kill payroll guards for sport. Tahan looked at the ledger in the marshal's hand. It was the weight he had carried for hundreds of miles. It was the sin and the salvation. There is one condition, Clayton added. He took a cigar from his pocket and bit the end off. When you get out, if you get out, the pardon comes with a stipulation. You need a fixed address. You need a sponsor, someone to vouch that you are not going to run off and start a war dance the minute you are free. The government is nervous about roaming elements. Tahan looked at the ground. He had no family. His lodge was ash. His people were scattered or imprisoned. He was a man of the wind, and the wind has no address. He has a place, Nora said. Her voice was clear, ringing across the yard like a church bell. Every head turned to her. Sheriff Holloway looked shocked. Mrs. Alvarez gasped quietly on the porch. He has a place, Nora repeated, stepping closer to Tahan. Here, the Callahan Ranch. Nora, Sheriff Holloway warned, stepping onto the bottom step. Think about what you are saying. You are a widow woman. He is a Comanche buck. The town will not stand for it. They will shun you. They will say you have lost your mind. Let them talk, Nora said, lifting her chin. The town did not help me when the roof leaked. The town did not help me when the cattle were stuck in the mud. The town did not stand on this porch and face down Samuel Briggs. She looked at Tahan. He paid for his shelter, she said. He paid with his blood. He paid with the truth about my husband. If the United States government needs an address for Elias Ward, you write down this one. Start route, Box 4, Llano Estacado, care of Nora Callahan. Tahan looked at her. His dark eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and something softer. Something that looked like hope breaking through a hard winter. Nora, he said softly, using her name for the first time without a title. You do not have to do this. The stain will not wash off. I am done with being clean, she said firmly. I want to be whole. Marshal Clayton struck a match on the porch rail and lit his cigar. He puffed smoke into the air, looking between the two of them. A slow, dry smile touched his lips beneath the mustache. Well, Clayton said, I have heard worse offers. Start route, Box 4. I will put it in the file. He turned to his deputies. Get Briggs' body on a horse. We ride in 10 minutes. The yard dissolved into activity. Men moved. Horses were brought around. The violence of the morning was being packed away, catalogued for the courts. Tahan walked to his piebald mare. He tightened the cinch, his movements automatic. He checked the stirrup leather. He did not have his weapons. The marshal had taken the rifle and the knife. He was a prisoner again. But this time, the chains felt different. Nora walked over to him. She stood by the horse's shoulder. 3 years, Tahan said, looking at the horizon. It is a long time. The seasons change. The grass grows and dies 3 times. I will be here, Nora said. The grass will grow here, too. They will treat you badly, he said. The churchwomen, the storekeeps, they will say you are waiting for a savage. I am waiting for a man, Nora corrected. She reached up and touched his arm. The flannel shirt was warm under her fingers. Do not let them break you. Tahan, do not let them wash the Indian out of you. You bring him back. I want both, the warrior and the man who saved the calf. Tahan covered her hand with his. I will hold on to him. And Elias, she said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small object. It was a silver dollar, one of the coins he had tried to pay her with on that first night. Keep this. He took the coin. It felt warm from her hand. Why? So you know you still have a debt to pay, she said, her eyes wet but smiling. You paid for the shelter. But you haven't paid for the breakfast I'm going to cook for you when you come home. Tahan closed his fingers over the coin. He nodded, unable to speak. He leaned down. He did not kiss her, not in front of the soldiers, not with the eyes of the law upon them. That was a private thing, a memory of the firelight. Instead, he pressed his forehead against hers for a fleeting second. Watch the sky, he whispered. I will leave the light on, she promised. Every night, on the porch. Mount up, the marshal shouted. Tahan swung into the saddle. He fell into formation behind the marshal. The column began to move, riding out through the gate that Tahan had fixed, past the woodpile he had stacked. He did not look back until they reached the ridge, the high ground where the world fell away. He turned in the saddle. The house was small from here, a speck of brown against the green and gray of the plains. But on the porch, a figure stood, unmoving, a small, defiant line drawn in the dirt. Tahan faced forward. He kicked the mare into a trot. He was riding toward a prison, but for the first time in his life, he was not running away. He was riding toward the future. The spring of 1878 came to the Llano Estacado not as a conqueror, but as a lover. The hard, unrelenting gray of the winter melted away, revealing a prairie that rippled with the vibrant green of buffalo grass and the startling blue of wild lupine. The wind, once a screeching banshee that stripped the paint from the wood, had softened into a steady, rhythmic breath that turned the blades of the new windmill Tahan had raised behind the house. The ranch had changed. It no longer looked like a fortress under siege. The fence lines, repaired and expanded, stretched toward the horizon like straight, confident strokes of a pen on a map. There were young peach trees planted on the south side of the barn, their fragile limbs shielded from the weather by a stone wall Tahan and Diego had built with their own hands. The house itself had grown. A new room had been added to the west side, the timber fresh and smelling of pine resin. Nora stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was 33 years old now, and while the sun had etched a few more lines around her eyes, they were lines of laughter, not sorrow. She watched the road. She was not waiting with a rifle this time. She was waiting with a pitcher of sweet tea and a heart that was full to bursting. The rider appeared first, a silhouette against the vast, shimmering canvas of the sky. He sat tall in the saddle, riding the bay gelding that had replaced the old piebald mare. But he was not alone. Behind him, a buckboard wagon rattled over the ruts, driven by Diego Alvarez, and in the back of that wagon were 3 small shapes huddled under blankets. Tahan reined in at the gate. He swung down from the horse with a grace that the years of prison and hard labor had not diminished. He wore a simple cotton shirt, a leather vest, and denim trousers tucked into work boots. The long hair of the Comanche warrior was cut shorter now, practical for a rancher, but he still wore a single turquoise bead braided into a lock behind his ear. You made good time, Nora called out, walking down the steps. Tahan smiled. It was a smile that transformed his face, erasing the stoic mask he had worn for so long. The river was low, he said. He walked to her, and in full view of the road and the sky, he kissed her. It was not a desperate kiss, nor a stolen one. It was the comfortable, claiming kiss of a husband greeting his wife. They had married 2 years ago, in a simple ceremony presided over by a circuit preacher who had looked nervous until he saw the way they looked at each other. There had been no guests from town, only the Alvarezes and the sheriff, but the vows had been spoken with a weight that shook the floorboards. "They are here?" Nora asked softly, looking toward the wagon. "They are here," Tahan said. 3 of them, brothers and a sister. The agency was going to send them east, to the schools where they cut the hair and forbid the language. I told the agent that I had room. Nora walked to the wagon. 3 pairs of dark, terrified eyes stared back at her. They were Comanche children, orphans of the reservation, thin and wary. "Hello?" Nora said. She did not speak Comanche well, but she knew the words for welcome and food. She spoke to them now. "I am Nora. This is your home." A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, peeked out. Beside him, a Mexican boy of 8, Leo, whom Nora and Tahan had adopted the winter before, jumped up onto the wagon wheel. "Come on," Leo said, offering a hand. "We have a dog named Buster. He is old, but he likes to have his ears scratched, and Mama makes cornbread." Tahan watched as Nora lifted the smallest child down. He felt a tightness in his throat, a familiar ache of gratitude. He had come here seeking refuge for a night. Now, he and the widow were building a shelter for the world. The ranch had become something of a legend in the territory, though the town of Tascosa still whispered about it. They called it the Refuge. It was a place where the lines on the map blurred. It was a working cattle ranch. Yes, the herd had tripled in size, and the beef Tahan raised was known for being the healthiest in the county. But it was also a sanctuary. Drifters down on their luck knew they could get a meal and a day's work without being asked about their pasts. Mexican families moving north found a safe campsite by the creek. And for the children who had been left behind by the wars, the mixed-blood outcasts, the orphans of the Indian Wars, it was the only place that did not look at them as a problem to be solved. That afternoon, Sheriff Holloway rode out. He was an old man now, his joints stiff, riding a placid mare instead of a stallion. He tied his horse to the rail and walked up to the porch, touching the brim of his hat. "Afternoon. Nora, afternoon. Tahan," the sheriff said. 5 years ago, he had been ready to hang Tahan. Today, he sat in the rocking chair Nora offered him and accepted a cup of coffee. "Saw you ride through town," Holloway said to Tahan. "Saw the wagon. We have new mouths to feed," Tahan said, sitting on the railing, whittling a piece of cedar for a toy horse. "Town folks are talking," Holloway said, blowing on his coffee. "The store keeps saying you ordered 50 pounds of flour." 60, Nora corrected. "Growing boys eat like wolves." Holloway chuckled. "Well, the mayor asked me to bring this out." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "It is the contract for the beef supply to the new railway station. They want the Callahan Ward beef. They say it is the best around." Tahan took the paper. He looked at the name at the top, Callahan Ward Ranch. "Do they pay a fair price?" Tahan asked. "Market rate plus 10% for delivery," Holloway said. "They know you are the only one who can get a wagon through the Canyon Pass without losing a wheel." Tahan nodded. "Tell them we accept." Holloway finished his coffee and stood up. He looked at the yard, where the new children were chasing the chickens, laughing as Leo showed them where the eggs were hidden. "You have built something good here, Elias," the sheriff said, using the white name, but with a tone of genuine respect. "I never thought I would see the day. A Comanche and a white woman, raising a tribe of their own." "It is not a tribe, Sheriff," Tahan said, looking at the children. "It is just a family." "Reckon so," Holloway said. "Reckon so." The integration was not perfect. There were still days when a cowboy from a passing trail drive would spit on the ground when Tahan walked by. There were still Sundays when Nora walked into church and a pew would clear out around her. But the venom was gone. The fear had been replaced by a grudging pragmatism. Tahan Ward was a man who paid his debts, kept his word, and could track a lost steer across 3 counties. In the West, utility often outweighed prejudice. The gold, the blood money that had started it all was gone. Tahan and Nora had made that decision the week he returned from prison. They had sat at the kitchen table with the heavy leather pouch. "We cannot build a life on this," Nora had said. So they had divided it. 1/3 went to an anonymous fund in St. Louis for the widows of the soldiers who had died in Briggs's staged attacks. 1/3 went to the reservation agency, designated specifically for blankets and medicine, hand-delivered by Marshal Clayton to ensure it was not stolen. The final 1/3 they kept. They used it to buy the lumber for the new barn roof. They used it to dig a deep, stone-lined well that never ran dry. Even in August, they used it to buy the seed for the garden. They took the metal that had been minted for greed and planted it in the earth, laundering the blood out of it until it produced life. As for the ledger book, the black book of death that had saved Tahan's life, it was locked in a cedar chest at the foot of their bed. Next to it lay a piece of parchment with a government seal, a full and unconditional pardon for Elias Ward, signed by the President of the United States. They never looked at the book. They did not need to. The past was ink on paper. The future was flesh and blood running in the yard. That evening, after the chores were done and the children were asleep in the new bunk room, Nora and Tahan sat on the porch. The night was vast and cool. The Milky Way was a river of crushed diamonds spilled across the dark. The silence of the plains was not empty. It was full of the chirping of crickets, the lowing of cattle in the distance, and the settling of the house timbers. They sat close. Nora sat on the swing, and Tahan sat on the floorboards, leaning back against her legs. Her hand rested on his shoulder, her fingers absently playing with the collar of his shirt. "Do you remember?" Nora asked softly. "The storm. I remember the cold," Tahan said. "I remember thinking that if I stopped moving, I would die. And then I saw the light." "I almost shot you," Nora mused. "I had the hammer pulled back." "You were a terrible shot with that Henry." Tahan teased gently. "You pulled to the left." "I hit Briggs," she countered, a shadow crossing her face for a moment, then vanishing. "Yes, you did." Tahan reached up and took her hand, pressing his lips to her palm. "You saved me, Nora, in every way a man can be saved. And you paid me," she whispered. "You tried to give me $2 for a stall." "I was a fool," Tahan said. "I thought shelter was something you bought. I did not know it was something you built." He turned, shifting so he could look at her. The moonlight caught the planes of his face, softening the scars that life had carved there. He was 40 years old now, and the anger that had once fueled him had burned down to a steady, warming coal. "Come here," he said. Nora slid off the swing and sat beside him on the floorboards. He pulled her into his arms. They fit together like 2 pieces of broken pottery that had been mended with gold stronger at the broken places. He kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss, tasting of coffee and the sweet night air. His hand moved to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. It was a touch that spoke of years of intimacy, of nights spent whispering in the dark, of the comfort of skin against skin. There was still fire between them, a heat that surprised them both with its intensity, but it was a grounded fire. It was the heat of a hearth, not a wildfire. "I love you. Elias," she whispered against his lips. "I love you." "Nora," he answered, "more than the grass loves the rain." Later, the children woke up. It was a common occurrence. The nightmares of the reservation or the war often chased them into the waking world. Leo and the new Comanche boy, Little Hawk, came out onto the porch, rubbing their eyes, dragging their blankets. "We cannot sleep," Leo said. "The coyotes are singing." "They are just telling stories," Tahan said. "Come, sit." The children huddled around them. Tahan threw a buffalo robe over their shoulders. "Tell us a story, Papa," Little Hawk said. "Tell us how you met Mama," Nora laughed, the sound bubbling up like water from a spring. "Oh, you want that story? Well, there are 2 ways to tell it." She looked at Tahan, her eyes twinkling. "The first way," Nora said, assuming a dramatic voice, "is that your father was a poor, wet, shivering puppy who showed up at my door in a storm. He looked so pathetic, dripping on my floor, that I took pity on him and let him sleep in the barn with the horses." The children giggled. Tahan snorted. "That is the woman's version." Tahan said, "The truth is, I was a great warrior, a ghost of the plains. I rode out of the storm on a thunderbolt. I had a bag of gold as big as a pumpkin. I saw this beautiful woman, but she was surrounded by dragons." "Dragons?" Leo asked, skeptical. "Captain Briggs was a dragon," Tahan said seriously. "He breathed fire, and I said, 'Woman, I will slay this dragon for you, but you must give me your heart.' And she said, 'Oh, brave warrior, take my heart and my barn.'" "Liar," Nora poked him in the ribs. "You paid me $2 silver and begged for a bucket of water." "And I got the water," Tahan said, grinning. "And the barn, and the woman. It was a good trade." He pulled the children closer. The smile faded a little, replaced by a gentle seriousness. "The truth," Tahan said, looking at the boys, "is that we were both lost. I was running from the past. Mama was hiding from the pain. We were alone in the storm, but we found that if we stood together, the storm could not blow us down." He looked at Nora, his eyes shining in the dark. "I paid for a night of shelter." He told them, "I thought I was buying a dry place to sleep, but what your mother gave me, what she gave me was a chance to be a man again, to be a father, to be a husband." He gestured to the ranch, to the windmill turning in the moonlight, to the sturdy fences and the sleeping cattle. "None of this was bought with gold," Tahan said. "It was bought with trust, and that is the only currency that matters out here." The children listened, their eyes wide, slowly. The rhythm of his voice and the warmth of the buffalo robe lulled them back toward sleep. Tahan looked out at the vast, open darkness of the Llano Estacado. It was no longer a place of blood and ghosts for him. It was a place of connection. He had found the bridge between his two worlds. He was not just Comanche, and he was not just a white man's scout. He was Tahan of the Callahan Ward Ranch. He was a man who belonged. He looked at the window of the house. The kerosene lamp was burning on the table, casting a warm, golden rectangle of light onto the porch. "The light is on," Nora whispered, following his gaze. "Yes," Tahan said, "and I am finally home." He pulled his wife and his children closer. The coyotes yipped in the distance, a wild, lonely sound. But on the porch, surrounded by the breathing of his family, Tahan felt a peace that was deeper than the ocean he had never seen. Years ago, he had paid a widow for shelter from a storm, but what she had given him was a life. And as the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time in the great silence of the West, Tahan knew that was a debt he would happily spend the rest of his days paying back. Thank you so much for listening to this story of redemption, love, and the untamed spirit of the frontier. If Tahan and Nora's journey touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these campfire tales can travel. Are you listening from a porch in Texas, a city apartment in London, or somewhere in between? Let's get a conversation going, and if you enjoyed this ride, please do not forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. If you really want to support the storytelling, smash that hype button so we can get this story heard by as many people as possible. Until the next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.